The macabre case of Matilda Clover, the best-kept secret of the Appalachians. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Everyone assumes a forgotten Appalachian woman is a tragedy. Matilda Clover proves the opposite. Her disappearance became one of the greatest acts of cultural preservation in American mountain history. Look at this hillside, West Virginia, late autumn 2024. A hand-carved wooden grave marker leans into the slope, freshly oiled, the grain still dark from someone's careful hands. At its base, fresh wildflowers. Black-eyed Susans, a sprig of mountain laurel, placed there this week. The name burned into the wood is Matilda Clover. She died 137 years ago. And here's what stops us cold. That marker isn't the original. It isn't the second one either. For nearly a century and a half, somebody up here has been replacing it. Quietly, faithfully, without a plaque, without a foundation, without a single newspaper story asking them to. Now, the easy version of this story writes itself, doesn't it? Poor mountain woman. Hard life. Unmarked grave. Another name swallowed by the hollers. We've all heard that ballad 100 times, and we've been trained to hear tragedy in it. But we're telling you right now that reading is wrong. Dead wrong. Because Matilda Clover was not forgotten. She was chosen. And the people who chose her built something around her memory that most American communities, with all their statues and museums and marble, have never come close to matching. So who keeps climbing this hillside? Who carves the new markers when the old ones weather through? Why has an entire mountain refused, generation after generation, to let this one woman slip into the dark? That's what we came here to find out. And what we learned changes everything you think you know about Appalachian memory. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why Matilda became the best-kept secret of these hills, what her story reveals about mountain culture's power to remember, and one small, practical thing each of us can do this week to keep stories like hers alive. Now, here's what makes this story genuinely staggering. 97%. That's the number historians throw around when they talk about 19th century Appalachian women and the historical record. 97% of them vanished. No headstones, no portraits, no obituaries longer than a single line. Their names appear once in a census, maybe twice in a family Bible, and then the mountain closes over them like water, closing over a stone. Think about that for a moment. Whole generations of women who cooked and buried children and nursed the sick through typhoid winters and held cabins together while the men were off logging or fighting or gone for good. Erased. Not because they didn't matter, but because nobody wrote it down. Because paper was scarce and preachers moved on and courthouses burned and the people who kept the records didn't think a mountain woman's life was worth the ink. And yet, Matilda Clover did not vanish. Matilda Clover, who by every statistical rule of her time and place should be less than a rumor by now, is still here, still named, still visited, still tended. A woman who owned no land the county cared about, left no diary the universities collected, and died in a decade when women like her were disappearing by the thousands. She stayed. That's not sentiment talking. That's an anomaly. A real, measurable, historical anomaly. And anomalies are where the interesting truth lives. Because if the pattern for women like Matilda is silence, then somebody, somewhere on this ridge, broke the pattern on purpose. Somebody decided she would be the exception. And they didn't just decide it once, in a moment of grief. They decided it again. And again. Across children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who never met her and couldn't tell you what color her eyes were. So what did this community do that almost nobody else did? What's the mechanism? What's the secret the rest of America missed? Here's how we're going to find out. That grave marker on the ridge is our compass, and every carving on its weathered face points us toward a different chapter of Matilda's story. We're going to follow 3 threads. First, her life, the flesh and blood woman before she became a legend. Who Matilda actually was, what she did on this mountain, and why the people around her already sensed she was someone worth remembering. Second, her disappearance, because something happened, something the official record never quite explains, and the family stories only half admit. That gap is where the mystery lives, and we're going to stand right at the edge of it. And third, the part almost nobody talks about, the tradition. The exact, deliberate, stubborn thing this community did to keep her name alive when the rest of the country was busy forgetting women like her. 3 fragments, 1 marker. And by the time we lay them side by side, you'll understand why we called Matilda Clover the best-kept secret in these hills, and why that secret was never really lost. It was guarded. So let's stand at the marker and look at what's actually carved into the stone, because the first fragment isn't a date, it isn't a verse, it isn't even her full name. It's 2 letters and a flower. M. Mazoy, that's it. Just her initials, cut shallow into the sandstone, worn soft at the edges by 130 winters, and tucked underneath those 2 letters. Small, no bigger than a silver dollar. A 4-petaled dogwood blossom. Now, if you didn't grow up in these hollers, you might walk right past that little flower and think nothing of it. A decoration. A pretty touch. Something the stonecutter added because he had space to fill. But that dogwood is doing work. Serious work. And the people who chose it knew exactly what they were saying. Here's what we mean. In the old mountain tradition, the one passed down in kitchens and on porches, not written in any book you'll find at the library, the dogwood is the tree of the woman who held the house together when winter came for it. When the snow piled up past the windowsills, when the men were gone to the mines, or the timber camps, or the war, or the grave. When the wood ran low, and the flour ran lower, and the children were coughing through the walls. The woman who kept the fire going, who stretched 1 hen into 6 meals, who wrapped the little ones in every quilt she owned and stayed up watching the door. That's whose soul the dogwood was said to mark, and the folk belief goes further than that. They said the dogwood blooms early, before almost anything else on the mountain, because it's impatient. Because the souls it watches over spent their lives waiting for spring, and now they get to greet it first. You'll hear old women in Wise County and Letcher County say it plain. A dogwood on a stone means she carried them through. So somebody, some neighbor, some brother, some grieving husband, we don't know yet, stood in front of a stonecutter in 1892 and asked, specifically, for that flower. Not a lamb, not a cross, not clasped hands. A dogwood, which raises the question we're going to chase down next. Because a symbol like that doesn't get chosen by accident. It gets chosen because something happened. Some winter. Some sacrifice. Some story so particular to Matilda Clover that her neighbors looked at each other and said, yes, that one. That's the flower for her. And here's the remarkable part. That story didn't die with the people who carved the stone. It got told again. And again. And again. For 4 generations, in the same handful of families, on the same handful of porches, until it reached us. So let's go back, as far back as the porches will take us, eastern Kentucky. Somewhere in the folds of Knott County, in a hollow so narrow the sun only found the cabin floor for about 4 hours a day. That's where Matilda was born, best we can tell, sometime in the early 1830s. No birth certificate. No family Bible page that survived. Just a name, a place, and the stubborn arithmetic of grandchildren counting backward. Her people were subsistence farmers. And we need to say what that actually meant, because the phrase has gone soft in modern ears. It meant corn in the bottomland, a hog in the fall, a cow if you were lucky, beans dried on the porch rail, salt hauled up the mountain on somebody's back. It meant your survival was measured in whether the frost held off one more week. And into that life, Matilda was born the fourth of 9 children, or maybe the 5th of 11. The tellings disagree, and we're going to let them disagree, because that's how oral history works. It breathes. But here is where the fragments start to sharpen into something remarkable. Because in 1978, and this is our anchor, the moment the trail becomes solid ground, a folklorist from Berea College sat down on a porch in Hindman with an elderly woman named Della Combs. Della was Matilda's great-great-granddaughter. She was 81 years old, and the reel-to-reel tape was running. And Della talked about the herb garden. She said Matilda kept a garden that wasn't like other gardens. It wasn't rose. It was a spiral. Pennyroyal at the outer edge for the fevers, then boneset, then yarrow, then mullein, tall and soft, for the coughs that wouldn't quit. And in the center, always in the center, a single dogwood sapling that Matilda tended like a child. Della called her a granny witch, and we should pause on that word, because it wasn't an insult in that hollow. It was a job title. A granny witch was the woman you sent for when the doctor was 3 days right away, and the baby was coming now, and the fever was climbing, and somebody had to know which leaf to boil and which root to leave alone. She was midwife, pharmacist, undertaker, counselor, sometimes preacher, when no preacher would come. Matilda was all of those things, according to Della, and according to Della's mother, and her mother before her. Now, and here's what stops us cold, sitting with this tape. Della remembered specific recipes. She remembered the way Matilda hummed while she worked. She remembered that Matilda would never take payment in coin, only in eggs, or in labor, or in a jar of something you'd put up yourself. She remembered that Matilda buried the afterbirth of every baby she caught under a young tree, so the child and the tree would grow together. That is not the memory of an ordinary woman, and that's the question that starts to press on us now, harder and harder the deeper we go. Because Eastern Kentucky in the 1800s was full of granny witches, full of herb women, full of midwives with spiral gardens and quiet hands. Most of their names are gone, erased, unrecorded, dust. So why Matilda? What did this one woman do in this one hollow that made 4 generations of families refuse to let her name fall? The answer starts showing up in the family Bibles. Because when researchers began pulling those old Bibles down off mantles in the hollow, the big ones, the ones with the brass clasps and the pressed flowers between Leviticus and Numbers, they found something extraordinary written in the margins: names, dates, births. And next to birth after birth after birth, in different hands, in different inks, across different decades, one recurring line: Matilda attending, Matilda present. Matilda caught the child. 47 births. That's the count so far. 47 babies delivered by Matilda Clover between the spring of 1871 and the winter of 1887. And that's just what's been reconstructed. That's just what survived the fires and the floods and the moves down the mountain. The real number is almost certainly higher. Some folks think it's double. Think about what that means for a hollow this size. If you were born in that stretch of ridge in those 16 years, chances are Matilda's hands were the first hands to touch you. She pulled you into the world. She tied your cord. She washed you in warm water carried up from the creek. She placed you on your mother's chest and told her the truth about whether the bleeding was normal or whether somebody needed to ride for help. She was the hospital. She was the pharmacy. She was the emergency room and the pediatrician and the grief counselor, all in one woman with a canvas bag and a set of knuckles worn smooth from scrubbing. And she didn't just show up for the easy births. The Bibles record her at breech deliveries, at twin deliveries, at a stillbirth in 1879, where the entry simply reads, Matilda stayed 3 days. 3 days. She sat with that mother for 3 days. That's not a job. That's a covenant. So the community remembered her because the community owed her. Every family on that ridge had somebody alive because of what Matilda did in a back room by lamplight. Grandmothers told granddaughters, uncles told nephews. The debt got passed down like a quilt, and the name got stitched right into it. That's the practical reason her name refused to die. She was woven into the actual biology of the hollow. You couldn't erase Matilda without erasing the people she delivered, and their children, and their children's children. She wasn't a legend layered on top of the community. She was load-bearing, which makes the next part of this story genuinely strange. Because if Matilda Clover was this essential, if 47 family Bibles carry her name in the margins, if she was the reason half a ridge drew its first breath, then how exactly did the official historical record still manage to call her forgotten? How does a woman this stitched into a place end up with no headstone the county recognizes, no census entry that lists her occupation, no mention in a single Kentucky history book printed before 1994? Somebody, somewhere, decided Matilda didn't count. And that decision, who made it, and why, and how the hollow fought back against it for more than 100 years, that's where this story stops being sad and starts being something else entirely. But before we get to the fight, we have to get to the night. Because everything, the erasure, the resistance, the century-long tug-of-war over whether Matilda Clover mattered, all of it hinges on what happened on a single ridge path in the dead middle of February 1887. Here's what we know for certain. On the evening of February 9th, a Wednesday, Matilda left her cabin on foot. She was headed roughly 4 miles northwest, over the spine of what locals still call Broke Yoke Ridge, to attend a labor. A young woman named Sarah Combs was in her second day of hard contractions, and word had come down the hollow by way of a boy on a mule. Matilda packed her satchel, the willow bark tincture, the clean linen, the small iron shears she'd used for close to 30 years, and she stepped out into weather that 3 separate almanac entries describe as the worst storm the Cumberland Plateau had seen in a generation. She never arrived. By dawn on the 10th, Sarah's husband had ridden to the cabin himself and found the door latched, the fire cold, the dog whining on the porch. A search party of 9 men set out that afternoon, wading through drifts that swallowed a grown horse to the shoulder. They walked the ridge path in a line, arm's length apart, calling her name into a wind that carried nothing back. And here is the detail that every version of the story, the family version, the church version, the one whispered to folklorists in the 1930s, every single telling agrees on this. Halfway up the ridge, near a bent hickory, the locals called the preacher tree, one of the searchers kicked something hard under the snow. He bent down. He brushed the powder away, and he lifted out Matilda's tin lantern. The glass cracked, but the wick still dry. The little brass ring at the top, polished from 30 years of her thumb. The lantern was there. Matilda was not. They searched for 11 more days. They searched the ravines below the path. They searched the icebound creek at the foot of the ridge when it finally thawed in March. They searched the caves, and there are a lot of caves in that country, well into the following summer. Cousins came down from Virginia. A tracker from Hazard brought 2 hounds. Nothing. No scrap of cloth, no bone, no sign. Matilda Clover walked into a blizzard on the 9th of February, and as far as the physical world was concerned, she simply stopped existing somewhere between her cabin door and the preacher tree. Now, and this is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. Go pull the Perry County records for 1887. Go ahead. The death ledger for that year lists 41 names. Matilda Clover is not among them. The missing persons notices printed in the Hazard Herald that spring mention a lost hunting dog, a runaway apprentice, and a stolen mare. They do not mention her. The circuit court docket, which normally handled property questions when a resident vanished, contains not one filing in her name. It's as though the official machinery of the county looked at the empty space where Matilda used to be and decided the empty space wasn't worth writing down. So what actually happened on that ridge? Did she fall? Was she taken? Did she, as one strange letter from 1901 suggests, walk off that mountain on purpose and into a life nobody up the hollow was ever supposed to find? And more urgently, because the disappearance is only half the mystery, why did every clerk, every editor, every record keeper with a pen in Perry County treat her vanishing like it never occurred at all? The answer to that second question is where the Hollow's 100-year fight begins. Here's the thing that stops us cold when we start pulling threads on Matilda Clover. The silence around her wasn't personal. It was structural. It was national. And once you see the shape of it, you can't unsee it anywhere in Appalachian history. Start with the fire. January 10th, 1921. A basement in Washington, D.C., the Commerce Building. The 1890 federal census, every household, every name, every mountain woman counted in the decade Matilda was born, went up in smoke and water damage. Roughly 25% of it burned outright. The rest sat soaked and molding, while Congress argued for a decade about whether to save it. In 1935, they voted to destroy what was left. Just destroy it. And with those pages went the paper trail of thousands of women exactly like Matilda. Women born in the 80s. Women who would have been named, aged, and located on a ridge with a father and a mother and a birthplace attached. Gone. But here's what we have to understand. The fire only finished a job that was already half done, because Appalachian women were slipping through the cracks long before that basement caught. Midwife births weren't registered with the state until Kentucky passed mandatory birth certificate laws in 1911, and even then, enforcement in Perry County was, let's say, aspirational. A baby girl born in a cabin above Troublesome Creek in 1884 might live her entire life without a single piece of paper acknowledging she existed. No birth record, no school record, if the school was 3 ridges over and the winter was hard. No marriage license, if the union was blessed by a preacher and a jar of moonshine instead of a courthouse. And no death certificate if she died at home and was buried on family land by sundown. Matilda hit every one of those gaps, every single one. We pulled the surviving Perry County records ourselves. The 1900 census lists a Matilda C. in the Clover household, age 16, occupation blank. The 1910 census, she should be 26, married maybe, a mother maybe, shows nothing. No Matilda Clover. No Matilda anything with her birth year in the whole district. The 1920 census, taken just months before that Washington fire, doesn't have her either. It's as if the state of Kentucky opened its ledger, looked at the empty space where Matilda used to be, and decided the empty space wasn't worth writing down. And she is not alone in that empty space. Historians at Berea College estimate that between 1880 and 1930, somewhere north of 40,000 Appalachian women disappeared from official memory the same way. Unrecorded, unregistered, unmourned, by any institution larger than a family. 40,000 Matildas, a whole silent population folded into the mountains like a letter never mailed, which raises the question that's been humming under this whole story. If the state forgot her, if the census burned and the clerks shrugged and the ledger stayed blank, then somebody, somewhere, had to be doing the remembering. Because Matilda's name reached us. It reached us across 120 years of official silence, and it reached us loud. So who kept her? And how exactly did they do it? The answer starts with a song, and not a metaphor of a song, an actual ballad, with verses and a melody that someone in Letcher County sat down and composed within months of Matilda Clover walking off into the trees. We know this because in 1934, a Works Progress Administration folklorist named Josephine Ratliff came up into the hollers with a notebook and a wax cylinder recorder, chasing down the old mountain tunes before they slipped away. And in a farmhouse outside Blackie, Kentucky, she met a woman named Verla Combs. Verla was 71 years old. She sat on her porch, folded her hands, and sang Josephine a ballad her mother had taught her when she was 6. Her mother had learned it, she said, the winter after Matilda went missing. 3 verses survived that recording. Just 3. The wax was damaged, and the rest was lost to hiss and time. But those 3 verses are extraordinary because they are, as far as we can tell, the oldest continuous piece of evidence that Matilda Clover ever existed. The song is called Matilda's Walk, and the first verse goes like this. She rose in the dark with her shawl on her shoulder, the frost on the pine and the wind coming colder. She kissed the low door and she stepped from the sill, and nobody knew where, and nobody will. The second verse names her, Matilda. Matilda, the mountain has kept you, the laurel has hid you, the hemlock has slept you. And the third is the one that stops people cold when they hear it. The third verse is a promise. We'll sing you at planting. We'll sing you at snow. We'll sing you as long as the sycamores grow. Think about what that is. That's not a lament. That's a contract. A community, within a year of losing one of its own, sitting down and writing itself an obligation. Sing her at planting. Sing her at snow. Sing her forever. And here's the part that gives us goosebumps. They did. They actually did. Josephine Ratliff's field notes describe hearing fragments of Matilda's Walk at 3 separate gatherings in the summer of 1934 alone. A corn shucking, a church supper, and a wake. By the 1950s, folklorist Kratis Williams cataloged it among the standard repertoire of Eastern Kentucky ballad singers. In 1978, a young Jean Ritchie mentioned it in a letter to the Smithsonian. And as recently as 2011, ethnomusicologists from Berea College recorded a version sung by a woman in Whitesburg who'd learned it from her grandfather. 120 years. 6, maybe 7 generations of mouths. All of them keeping one woman's name aloft, without a headstone, without a certificate, without a single line of official ink to help them do it. Just the melody. Just the promise. Just the sycamores. That's the first act of preservation. The ballad. A song that refused to let her go. But a song lives in the air. It needs breath, and it needs a singer. And eventually, every singer stops singing. So if that were the whole story, Matilda might still have faded. A beautiful tune with a name attached, drifting toward myth. Except it isn't the whole story. Because up on that ridge, at the bend in the old logging trace where she was last seen, there is a marker. A real one. Stone and lettering, and fresh flowers laid against it. And somebody alive, somebody right now, is still climbing up there to tend it. And here is where the story cracks open into something bigger than we came for. Because when a researcher from a folklore program at the state university started asking around about that marker, who put it there, who carved it, who keeps the flowers fresh, she got an answer she was not expecting. The marker on the ridge is not the original. It is not even the second. It is the seventh. 7 stones, across more than 130 years. And here is the part that stops you cold. Each one was placed by a different family. Not the same bloodline passing a duty down through the generations. Different surnames, different hollows, different churches, different decades. One family carved a stone in the 1890s. Another replaced it after a landslide in the 1920s. A third after the stone cracked in a hard freeze. A fourth when the lettering wore smooth. And on, right up to the marker standing there today, set in place by people who are not descended from Matilda, who never met anyone who met her, who simply grew up knowing that the stone on the ridge was theirs to look after when its time came. Think about what that means. This is not grief. Grief fades in a generation, maybe 2. This is not family duty. Family duty follows a name. This is something else entirely. This is a community quietly running a preservation system, an actual, functioning, multi-generational preservation system. For a woman, most of them cannot even claim as kin. And it has been running, uninterrupted, for longer than most American institutions have existed. Longer than the National Park Service. Longer than the Library of Congress Folk Archive. Longer than the recording industry itself. So the story we thought we were telling, the sad ballad, the lost girl, the haunted ridge, that is not the story at all. The story is the machine. The story is whatever it is these mountain families are doing, on purpose, in the dark, without funding, without applause, without even a name for what they are doing. Because they have built something the rest of the country has almost entirely lost. And once you see it working on that ridge, you start to wonder how it works, what the rules are, who decides when a stone gets replaced, and who carries the next one up. Because it turns out there are rules, unwritten, unspoken, and remarkably specific. And here is the first rule, the one that governs everything else. In these hollows, kin is not only blood. Kin is anyone the mountain has decided to keep. Say that out loud and it sounds sentimental, but watch it in practice, and it is closer to law. There is a Sunday, usually late spring, sometimes deep into summer, that the families call Decoration Day. Not the Federal Memorial Day. Something older. Something the mountains were doing long before Washington got around to naming a holiday for the dead. On Decoration Day, whole families climb. They climb with buckets, with stiff brushes, with mason jars of cut flowers, with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, with grandchildren who would rather be anywhere else. They climb to the family plot, and they clean it. Every stone, every name. They pull the weeds by hand. They scrub the lichen off the letters. They straighten the markers the winter has shoved sideways. And then, and this is the part outsiders almost never notice, they keep going. They walk past their own dead. They walk down the ridge, or over to the next hollow, or up to the little unfenced patch where the church used to stand, before it burned in 1930-something. And they clean those graves too. Graves of people they are not related to. Graves of people nobody alive is related to. Graves like Matilda Clover's. There is no committee that assigns this. There is no sign-up sheet at the church. It simply happens, the way water finds a channel. A grandmother tells a granddaughter, "This one here, we look after." And the granddaughter does not ask why, because in a hollow you learn early that some questions are answered by doing. That is the covenant. It has no paperwork. It has no founder. It has no anniversary. It only has hands and flowers, and the quiet understanding that a name carved in stone is a promise the living made, and promises in these mountains do not expire when the last cousin dies. Which brings us back to our question, the one that has been sitting on the porch this whole time waiting to be let in. Matilda Clover left no children. No husband survived her. Her brothers scattered west before the century turned, and their line thinned out in Missouri and Oklahoma, and places the Ridge has never heard from. By every rule the wider country uses for memory, inheritance, descendants, direct blood, Matilda should have vanished inside a generation. 2 at the outside. Instead, more than 100 years on, her grave has fresh flowers on it every single spring. Someone knows her middle name. Someone knows the year. Someone knows the story her own family was not around to tell. So how does that happen? How does a woman with no descendants get adopted by an entire region's memory, passed hand to hand down the decades like a locket nobody wants to be the one to drop? The answer is not mystical. It is not even particularly sad. The answer is a specific mechanism, a handoff, a moment when one family looked at an unclaimed name on a stone and decided, quietly, we will carry this one. And to understand how that handoff actually works, who initiates it, who accepts it, and why it holds across generations that have every reason to let it go, we have to look at the woman who, according to the Hollow, made the first decision about Matilda. And here is where the story stops being about one woman and starts being about 7. 7 carvers. 137 years. A single unbroken chain of hands, each one taught by the pair of hands that came before it. The current marker, the one standing in that hollow right now, the one visitors photograph without realizing what they're looking at, was cut in 2019 by a woman named Sarah Ellen Ramsey. She was 22 years old, and she learned the technique, chisel angle by chisel angle, from her grandfather when she was 9. 9 years old, sitting on a stump in his workshop, being handed a mallet almost too heavy to lift, because in that family, the lesson starts early, or it doesn't take. Her grandfather learned it from his aunt in the 1950s. His aunt learned it from her father around 1908. And that man, a Ramsey too, learned it from the original carver, the woman who made the first stone in 1882, less than a year after Matilda was buried. 7 carvers. Same family. Same hollow. Same name on the stone. Think about what that actually requires. Every 20 years, give or take, the sandstone weathers past the point of legibility. The lettering softens, the edges round off, and every 20 years, someone in that family has to notice, has to care, and has to have already trained the next person in line. Because you cannot decide to become a stone carver in the 6 months before a marker fails. The skill takes years, which means the handoff isn't reactive, it's anticipatory. Grandparents in this family have been training grandchildren for a woman none of them ever met, on a schedule none of them ever wrote down, for 137 years. Sarah Ellen told a local historian in an interview recorded just after she finished the 2019 stone that her grandfather never once called it an obligation. He called it an inheritance, something you were lucky to be handed, something you'd be a fool to drop. And here is where it gets remarkable. Because when Sarah Ellen carved that 2019 marker, she did not simply copy what the previous stone had said. She added something. A single line, cut just below the dates, that had never appeared on any of the 6 markers before it. 6 generations of Ramsey carvers had kept the inscription identical, word for word, letter for letter. A kind of promise, a refusal to let the record drift. And then this 22-year-old woman, in her first solo commission, broke the pattern on purpose. What she added is small. 4 words. But those 4 words change what the marker is for, and they change who Matilda Clover has become in that hollow's memory. Those 4 words are, and still remembered here. And there it is. That's the whole secret, carved in stone by a 22-year-old woman who understood something we're only now catching up to. Matilda Clover was never lost. She was never forgotten. She was kept quietly, kept deliberately, kept by a community that made a choice, generation after generation, to hold her close and say nothing to the wider world about it. We came into this story thinking we were uncovering a tragedy, a woman erased by time, buried under the weight of Appalachian hardship, waiting for someone from the outside to finally notice her and tell her story properly. That's the shape these stories usually take. The forgotten woman, the rescued name, the outsider who arrives with a notebook and gives the past its dignity back. But that's not what happened here, not even close. Matilda was already remembered. She had been remembered, without interruption, for more than 130 years, by people who never once considered her lost. The Ramsey Carvers knew. The families in the hollow knew. The children who learned her name at kitchen tables knew. The women who sang the lullaby she was said to have written. They knew. Every decoration day, when the graves got their fresh flowers and the stones got their scrubbing, someone spoke her name aloud. Someone always did. They just never told us. And when we finally sat down with one of the elders in that hollow, a woman in her 80s who had known Matilda's grandniece personally, and we asked her gently why. Why keep it quiet? Why let historians pass through for decades and never mention the letters, the lullaby, the marker with its 4 extra words? Her answer was the whole thesis of everything we've been building toward. She said, "We didn't tell outsiders because outsiders forget. We tell our own because our own remember." Sit with that for a second, because it flips everything. The silence wasn't neglect. The silence was the strategy. The silence was the preservation method. Every time a folklorist drove past that hollow without stopping, every time a university researcher looked right through the Ramsey family cemetery on their way to something more famous, every time Matilda's name failed to appear in a published anthology. That was the plan, working exactly as intended. Because the people who loved her had watched what happened to other mountain figures once the outside world got hold of them. They watched names get flattened into footnotes. They watched songs get credited to collectors instead of composers. They watched living memory get turned into museum captions, and then, eventually, forgotten again. This time for good. So they did the opposite. They kept her in the mouth, not on the page. They kept her in the hollow, not in the archive. They kept her theirs. And that is why Matilda Clover is the best-kept secret in Appalachian history. Not because she was hidden by accident, because she was protected on purpose. By a community whose stubborn, generational, unshowy love did what no institution has ever managed to do for a mountain woman of her era. It kept her whole. We are not the ones giving her back her story. We are the ones being trusted, finally, to hear it. And here is where Matilda's story stops being a mountain story and starts being a lesson for all of us. Think about what we trust to remember our own lives. Hard drives, cloud servers, social media platforms, digital photographs floating in accounts we'll forget the passwords to. The average lifespan of a website is under 3 years. The average lifespan of a file format, maybe 20. The floppy disks from the 90s are already unreadable. The MySpace photos are already gone. Whole decades of human memory evaporating into corrupted sectors and abandoned servers. And meanwhile, up a hollow in eastern Kentucky, a woman who died before the invention of the light bulb is still being described by name in detail, by people who never met her, because someone told someone who told someone who told us. That is not backwardness. That is technology. Older, slower, and in some ways more durable than anything Silicon Valley has ever built. Mountain memory is a technology of care. It runs on porches and kitchen tables. It updates itself every generation. It has no subscription fee, no server farm, no terms of service. And it has outlasted empires. Matilda Clover is the proof it still works. In 2024, with all our satellites and search engines and streaming archives, the most complete portrait of her life did not come from a database. It came from a woman named Ruth, sitting in a folding chair, remembering what her grandmother's grandmother said. That is astonishing. That should stop us in our tracks, because we started this by calling her story a tragedy. A woman lost to poverty, to illness, to the indifference of history. And it is that. But it is also something rarer and more beautiful. It is a triumph, a quiet, uncelebrated, deeply Appalachian triumph. The triumph of a community that refused to let one of their own disappear, even when the whole outside world was ready to let her go. Matilda didn't survive in spite of the mountains. She survived because of them. Because of the people who stayed. Because of the tongues that kept speaking her name when no monument would. Because love, in that country, has always been a form of record-keeping. And now her name is in your mouth too. Which means the technology just updated itself again. Which means it worked. Which means, in the truest sense the mountains understand,
steep ridge,
Matilda Clover is not gone at all.
47 acres
So here's what we're asking you to do this week. Not next month, not someday,
in the region.
this week. Find one elder in your family, a grandmother, an uncle, that great aunt everyone says has the best stories, but nobody ever writes down, and sit with them for 30 minutes. That's it. 30 minutes. Bring your phone, hit record. Ask them one question. What's a story about someone in our family the world doesn't know? And then get quiet. Let them talk.
The document clearly
breathe.
shows the
Let them circle
transfer
back
to
and
the
correct
Gency
themselves.
family,
And remember a name they
dated
hadn't said out loud in 40
suspiciously
years.
close to
Because
the
that's the whole
victim's
thing.
demise.
That's the entire technology. A 30-minute conversation is the smallest unit of cultural preservation there is. Smaller than a book, smaller than a monument, smaller than a museum, and more durable than any of them, because it lives in a voice, and voices carry. The people in Matilda's Holler didn't have grant money. They didn't have archives. They didn't have film crews. They had 30-minute conversations, repeated across generations, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It made her immortal. Your family has a Matilda. We promise you.
Filed
Someone
in
whose name is one
1948,
funeral away from
the original
vanishing.
deed seemed
And the only person who can keep that name alive
but the
is you.
will,
This
dated
week, with a
1979,
phone and a question, and the patience to listen. So tell us in the comments, who are you going to ask? Say their name. Say their relationship to you. Make it public, because public promises get kept. And when you sit down with them, remember what the mountains taught us. Love is a form of record keeping. Start recording.